Welcome along to Season 3 of Into the Sky, where we soar through the captivating story of the iconic Avro Vulcan XH558. I'm your host, Martin Price, and this season we're bringing you an all-star lineup of guests, a pilot who commanded this magnificent aircraft, the dedicated volunteers preserving her legacy, and the education partners inspiring South Yorkshire's youth and the team shaping XH558's future. Join us as we unravel the rich history of this Cold War titan, discover how she's fueling STEM education, explore how lessons from the past are engineering tomorrow's innovations. From the cockpit to the classroom, Into the Sky bridges generations, proving that XH558's influences reach far beyond the runway. Buckle up for a journey that'll span decades and touch the lives of many. This is more than a podcast, it's a flight through history, innovation and inspiration. So welcome along, here we are, another episode, and today I'm joined by a gentleman who is a bit of a legend in the aviation circles, and particularly if you're a Vulcan fan. He's quite literally known as the Rumenator. Ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome Kev Rumens. Afternoon, Kev. How are you?
Very good, thank you.
Excellent. It's good to have you here today, and I've got loads of questions for you, so I hope you're ready for loads to be fired at you. So, first and foremost, can I ask you, how did you become involved with the Vulcan?
Well, I joined the RAF in the 80s and flew my first squadron on Victor Tankers, 55 Squadron. And while I was on the 55 Squadron as a co-pilot, I was just happened to be right place, right time. And I was asked if I wanted to join the Vulcan display flight. So at the time, the RAF had stopped flying Vulcans operationally, but they kept one aircraft, 558, flying as a display aircraft, and I was just asked, "Do you fancy joining the team?" Which, as a 21-year-old, was outstanding. So I did 2 seasons flying 558 when the aircraft was still owned by the RAF. That's how I initially came involved with the Vulcan.
Wow. Do you know, having spoken to a few of the people who have been involved in the RAF, your military service, it just seems you've got to be in the right place at the right time for the right thing, doesn't it?
Exactly, yeah. I mean, at the time, the RAF were keeping 558 flying as a display aircraft, but some of the rules they insisted on were that the pilots were in current 4-jet practice, which meant the pilots would have to come from either Victors, Nimrods, or VC-10s. And most of the guys that were on 55 Squad on the Victor with me were ex-Vulcan pilots anyway. So 90% of the Vulcan display flight was manned by fellow pilots on 55 Squadron. And a slot came up on the VDF team. They needed an extra co-pilot, and I was just right place, right time. And, you know, when you get offered the chance to display an aircraft in the RAF, it's very special. So I was elated and jumped at the chance to fly 558 as a display aeroplane. I was still flying the Victor during the week as my main job, and we were flying 558 as a display aircraft at weekends.
So you didn't have to have a moment to think about it then, Kev? There was none of that pause moment, no?
No, not at all. I mean, I was only 21 when I started flying 558, and it was a real shock that I was even considered for the position. So I literally almost had to take a second to think, is this real? When are they actually asking me this, or are they just spoofing me?
So, obviously, like you just said there, you were involved in the Vulcan display team. Can you describe then a memorable flight in 558 whilst you were in the display, whilst you were part of the display team?
It's difficult to come up with a single memorable flight. I mean, displaying any aircraft in the Air Force is an honour and a privilege. And most flights will have a string of memories associated with them. Personally, I used to enjoy going to air shows where we would land at the air show and then we would take off, display and land. A lot of the time with the Vulcan, we would take off and fly to an air show, display, and then fly away. So we weren't actually landing at the air show. So most of my really good memories are from the air shows where we actually landed and we actually got to meet the public at the air shows, but more importantly, it's quite thrilling to actually take off and go straight into a display from takeoff. Whereas most of our displays, we would arrive, fly over the airfield, and then go into the display after a fly through.
I sort of get what you're talking. Not that I'm a pilot, obviously, but yeah, getting involved with the public, I can understand that. Yeah. So flying the Vulcan then obviously comes with certain challenges. So what would you say were the unique challenges of piloting a Vulcan compared to any other aircraft that you've flown?
Well, all aircraft are very similar to fly. I sort of quite jokingly say when people ask me about this that, you push the throttles forward and they make noise, and then you pull back on the stick and the cows get smaller. All aircraft fly under similar kind of principles. The Vulcan is different because the delta wing makes it quite a different aircraft to fly. But also the 558, the cockpit of a Vulcan. My experience is only of 558. I flew 2 years with the RAF and I flew for 8 years as a civilian display pilot. But I've only ever flown in that one aircraft. But the Vulcan cockpit is quite small, quite cramped. Originally, it was designed to be a single pilot aircraft. And then because the RAF decided they were going to arm the aircraft with nuclear weapons, they decided it had to have two pilots for the sort of the two-man principle of dropping a nuclear weapon. So they crammed two ejection seats into a cockpit that had been designed for one. So it was very, very small, cramped. The view out of the cockpit is pretty poor. So displaying an aircraft with the power that we had, and not being able to really see where you're going half the time was quite a challenge.
So you were talking there about the delta wing on the aircraft as well. How does that affect the handling and performance of the aircraft itself?
Deltas fly quite differently to an aircraft with what I regard as, say, a straight wing. Most aircraft these days have got some kind of sweep, but effectively a straight wing. So if you look at a light aircraft like a Cessna or something like that, the stall characteristics of an aircraft wing that you would see on a small aircraft are quite different to the stall characteristics of a Delta. A small aircraft or a straight-winged aircraft, the wing will actually stall normally around about 14 to 15 degrees angle of attack. With the Delta, you can stall part of the wing, low angles of attack, but the Vulcan, to actually stall the whole wing, you've got to be into the 50s in terms of angle of attack. So we would fly the Vulcan intentionally slow, and we would be partly stalled the whole way through the display. But the outer third of the Delta wing would be stalled. The inner two-thirds are still flying. But that allowed us to fly a very slow display, stay very much in front of the crowd, making lots of noise, because flying slow, we needed lots of power to be able to control the aircraft in that slow speed state. And it just made the Vulcan display so much more enjoyable to watch from the ground, because unlike a fast jet that whistles by and then 2 minutes later they have to turn around and come back again, we would fly the whole display slow in front of the crowd, making lots of noise. So then, and the Delta stall characteristics allowed us to fly the aircraft slow and fly that kind of display.
Wow, so that gave it greater stability at lower altitudes, which if we were talking in operational terms, made it successful then for low altitude as well as high altitude flying. Is that correct?
Well, the Vulcan was originally designed as a high level bomber, and it could carry nuclear weapons. It's not great at low level because the big wing made it quite uncomfortable to fly at low level. In the sort of 60s, when Powers was shot down in a U-2 up at 60,000 feet, the RAF suddenly realised that actually flying in the high 50,000 feet, you were still susceptible to surface-to-air missiles. So they moved the Vulcan down into the low-level bombing role. But actually, it was quite an uncomfortable ride at low level because it was quite bumpy. But that was flying at high speed. We flew the aircraft intentionally slow, so it wasn't uncomfortable. It was just slightly different to fly an aircraft that slow as part of an air show display.
I get what you're saying there. And is it any particular tense or exciting moments that you can recall while flying 558?
Not really, no, because the last thing you actually want are tense moments, and we tried to avoid them. When obviously I left the Victor and went on to fly Tornadoes for the rest of my career in the Air Force, and I had many tense moments flying the Tornado, but that's just a function of the sort of the speed and the fact that we were flying low near the ground the whole time. Obviously, I flew the aircraft in Gulf War II as well, so we had a few tense moments there. But in 558, as a display aircraft, we flew the aircraft well within our limits, well within the aircraft limits, and we planned to stay away from tense moments. So I can't really talk about any tense moments because it's something that we plan to stay clear of.
Right. And again, you were talking about the cockpit in 558, and she is quite cramped conditions in there, isn't she?
Very much.
What was the camaraderie like then amongst the Vulcan crew itself?
Well, obviously, I never flew the Vulcan operationally, so my experience of the Vulcan are only as a display team. When we flew 558 as part of the RAF display, the Vulcan display flights, we had two crews. So we had two captains, two first officers, and then the rear end crew, the NAVs and the AEOs. And the reason for that was we had a busy air show schedule throughout the year. We were flying at weekends, and it was deemed, as a voluntary thing. And we were still expected to fly during the week, and it was just too much for one crew to fly 7 days a week. So 7 days a week all the way through the summer. So we had two crews, and we all got on very, very well. We mixed and matched. So sometimes I'd fly with one of the captains, sometimes we'd fly with the other captain, and the same with the rear crew. Later, when we flew 558 as a civilian display aircraft, we flew it then with 5 pilots and 2 AEOs. So there were 7 of us in the team, and we were a very, very close-knit team. Obviously, when you fly, you've always got 2 pilots on board and an engineer, or air electronics officer. I tend to sort of say flight engineer because a lot of people in the civilian world recognise flight engineer as opposed to AEO, but they're similar kind of roles. But we had air electronics officers. So when we were flying, we would have 2 pilots and an AEO, and the 5 pilots in the team and the 2 AEOs we were a very close knit team, and we got on very, very well.
Brilliant. Yeah, I mean, from my experience of being around the hangar, seeing you guys, it seemed that the camaraderie was there between you all. Yeah. So obviously the unique thing about the Vulcan is its howl. What's it like that when you're in the cockpit itself? Tell me about that.
It is noisy. You could definitely, when you make the engines howl, you can definitely hear it, and the airframe vibrates quite a lot when you do it as well. Obviously, we're aware that it's a bit of a crowd-pleasing element of the show, so we would always make sure that we do fly the aircraft in a position where we can make the engines howl once or twice in a display. And like I say, because we fly slow, we're quite often doing that right in front of the crowd. So the engine howl does sound great from the outside, but it is also very noisy from the inside when we do it.
Really? Wow, what, far noisier than we would probably think it is?
I would imagine so, yes. I mean, we're flying with flying helmets on, and the helmets fit our heads quite closely, and we've got ear sort of muffs inside, which is our radio and intercom are fed through the ear muffs. But the helmets are still quite tight on our heads, and even with that, they do muffle most noises. But when you make the engines howl, you can hear it, no problem at all, even with the flying helmet on.
Wow. Blimey. And you said that about, obviously, it affects the airframe. So can you actually feel the vibration through the flying controls? Or?
Through the seat of your pants. So that you're sat on an ejection seat, and you can actually feel the airframe vibrating when you do that. I mentioned earlier on that we fly the aircraft slowly on purpose, and that we've got about a third of the delta wing stalled. We are flying in what we call buffet. So buffet is an indication the aircraft is about to stall. Normally in a straight-winged aircraft, buffet, you would be worried and you would be carrying out a stall recovery manoeuvre. We're flying the aircraft purposely in that stall. And when we're flying that slow, the aircraft is buffeting or shaking, and you can feel that through the seat and through the seat of your pants, or the whole display pretty much.
Blimey. Does it help you lose weight by any chance?
Not necessarily, but the one thing that a lot of people don't appreciate is that the Vulcan was designed as a 55,000-foot high-level bomber. The air conditioning system in the Vulcan was designed to take the outside air, which is 55,000 feet, is about minus 60, and it would warm the air up to a suitable temperature for the crew inside the cockpit. What didn't have any ability to do was take hot air and cool it down. So when we're flying in displays, and we were sometimes jump into the aircraft an hour before the displays start the engines and be preparing ourselves for the display, it would get hotter and hotter and hotter. And we had a couple of remote thermometers, and there were times when the temperature in the cockpit got into the 50s. So we would sometimes, on a sort of 2.5, 3 hour flight, you would climb out of the aircraft and you probably would be sort of 3 or 4 pounds lighter than you got in. And that was just because you'd lost so much water. And you drink 2 or 3 litres of water when you climbed out of the aircraft, and you're back to your normal weight again.
Blimey, heck. So going back to when you, obviously 558 was retired from the RAF, it went to Bruntingthorpe. When you heard the news that it was going to be restored to flight, how did you feel about that?
Well, that was quite a long process. One of the captains that I flew with on the Vulcan display flight was Dave Thomas. Dave and I have remained friends for many years. He would phone me up every year when I was on the Tornado and say, look, we're going to restore the aircraft back to flying status. Are you going to come and fly with us? And I would say, oh, yes, definitely. But in the back of my mind, I always had this, there's absolutely no way the Civil Aviation Authority are ever going to let that aircraft fly. And I get another phone call the next year. Oh, it's progressing. Are you still okay to, when we get going, are you still okay to join the team and come back and fly with us? And I'd always say, yeah, Dave, I'm really interested. But I still had in the back of my mind had this, it'll never happen. And then one day Dave phoned up and said, right, we're doing the air test in 2 weeks' time. I almost fell off my seat because I honestly, genuinely believed that to restore the Vulcan back to flying status was one thing, but to get the Civil Aviation Authority to allow you to fly it was another. They notoriously are quite worried about ex-military aircraft with live ejection seats. And so I'd rather assumed that it would never happen. And when Dave finally phoned me up after many years of these phone calls saying, oh, we're progressing, to say, oh, we're going flying in 2 weeks, get down here and we'll start training up for the display season, it was quite a shock to me, to be honest with you.
I bet it was. I would never have ever had you down as a skeptic there, but obviously you know the industry better than most. Yeah, I can see your reasons why you had your reservations there, mate. Yeah,
I mean the military fly quite differently to the civilian world, and being a display pilot in the Air Force is one thing. Being a display pilot of an ex-military aircraft under civil aviation rules is quite different. And I honestly didn't think it'd ever happen.
Yeah, well, you mentioned there about the ejector seats, which made me sort of think there maybe that's why we're not seeing fast jets like the Phantom.
Yeah, I mean, there was a consortium that had a couple of Lightnings, and they were desperate to try and restore them back to flying status and actually take them around the air shows. And the Civil Aviation Authority were never, ever going to let that happen. Because, high performance fast jet with ejection seats just freaks them out.
Well, you mentioned Lightnings, they're just like rockets, them things, aren't they?
That's what I wanted to fly when I joined the Air Force. As a kid, I always wanted to be a Lightning pilot.
Well, you're near enough there. Tornadoes, you weren't far off, mate. So what do you think the Vulcan's most significant legacy in aviation history will be?
I would say that the aircraft was a stalwart of the RAF's Cold War efforts. So, will always be known as a Cold War bomber. You'd like to think in those kind of circumstances that whilst you've got a deterrent, you'll never use it. And the Vulcan was never actually used in the Cold War, although it was used in the Falklands. So it was actually used operationally for one conflict. But more than that, I always think of the Vulcan as just an amazing British aircraft aviation industry, a flag that just shows how in the sort of post-World War II, late 40s, early 50s, early 60s, the British aviation industry was just amazing. And the Vulcan was right there at the forefront of that. When you look at sort of the Lancaster, that was built by Avro, and as was the Vulcan. And they went from sort of a piston 4-engine aircraft with wooden materials to a metal jet aircraft that could fly at 50,000 feet and carry nuclear bombs. And the Vulcan first flew 11 years after the Lancaster first flew. So the British aviation industry was just phenomenal at that time.
What do you think the Vulcan's legacy should be moving forward?
Well, I think it's got to be able to be available to the public to see, to be able to teach kids in the future about the past.
As Robert's legacy was, look at the past to inspire to the future. And, how components that were made back then for the Vulcan are still being made to this day and used in modern aircraft. Sometimes you've got to look backwards to look forwards, haven't you?
You have, yes. And it's important to remember where you've come from. You can use that. Obviously, history is great for learning from the past, and moving on to the future. And the Vulcan is an important part of the British aviation industry. And you could look at the Vulcan and then just look at the Concorde, which was years later, with exactly the same shaped delta wing, the same Olympus engines, and they'd taken concepts from an aircraft developed in the early 50s, and then they were years later flying passengers supersonic across the Atlantic, based on technologies that were come from the Vulcan.
So I've got one more question for you. I've saved this as long as I could. I didn't go without asking you this question, right? So 2015, you know what's coming here, don't you? I can see you. Your final display with the Vulcan at RIAT, that memorable takeoff that you did. What was your thought process on that day? Was it planned? Was it not? Was it just... take me through it, Kev. Let us into a few seconds.
Okay, first of all, it was fully planned and fully briefed. So it wasn't just something we did at the drop of a hat. We planned it as the crew, and we talked about it and briefed it. The thing you have to remember is that most of our flying, when we displayed 558, was flown out of Doncaster, and you would fly to 1, 2, 3 displays sometimes, and then you'd land back at Doncaster. So you wouldn't be taking off from the venue you were displaying. So it's quite special when you are able to take off and display. So some of the displays in the past that are memorable to me, Fairford, Waddington, Farnborough, where we were actually able to take off and go straight into the display. A lot of people don't appreciate that the aircraft can carry quite a lot of weight, quite a lot of fuel in weight. So an example of one of the trips I flew a few years ago, we took off from Doncaster, went to Sunderland and displayed at the beach at Sunderland. Then we went up to East Fortune at Edinburgh and displayed at Edinburgh. Then we went down to Windermere and displayed at Lake Windermere in the Lake District, and then came back to Doncaster. Well, when we took off from Doncaster for that trip, which was just under 3 hours, we had about £60,000 of fuel on board. And the first display at Sunderland, we had about £50,000 of fuel on board. When I took off in 2015 at RIAT, because I'm planning to take off, fly an 8-minute display and land, I only had £10,000 of fuel on board. And that makes the aircraft significantly lighter and easier to handle. So we were able to change our display subtly because of the weight differences compared to a lot of the displays we flew. So RIAT, we knew we were going to take off, display, land. So we had a light fuel load. I was also aware that, it was our final year. So I wanted to try and, fly a display that was subtly different to ones we've flown in the past. And the big difference really was the fact that we were going to take off and go into the display. If you actually, apart from the takeoff, if you look at the display itself, it's exactly the same display we've been flying all year. And in actual fact, all 5 of us pilots all flew the same display. So that when you fly a display and you are not flying it, you are the pilot monitoring, you're in the other seat, you know exactly what's coming next from the guy flying, because we all fly the same display. And that display was something that we would sit down and go through at the beginning of the season. We'd have a few ideas. Could we put this in? Could we put that in? And we tried different things over the years. We had, full power spiral climbs and a few different bits and pieces. But the display at RIAT was our standard display. It was just the fact that I was taking off into the display. RIAT had a rule which is primarily for the fast jets. They had a rule of no turns below 50 feet. And that's really just to stop the fast jets getting airborne, raising the wheels and then just turning to, really, really close to the ground. What we planned and briefed that we would do would take off and turn into the display straight after takeoff. But I deliberately climbed the aircraft to 110 feet because I knew that my downgoing wing, which is a 60-foot wingspan, would actually would descend in the turn. But I made sure that I kept every part of the aircraft above 50 feet. So in the spirit of that no turns below 50 feet, no part of the aircraft was below 50 feet in that turn. But the big thing about that is big aircraft don't normally do that. So it was going to be a bit of a shock display start, something that people don't generally see from big aircraft. So we decided that that's what we would do. We would do something a little bit different. It was all legal within the rules, but it's just you don't generally see big aircraft do that sort of thing.
Absolutely not. And it lit YouTube, that thing, did it? The fact that you did that, YouTube was on fire that day. So, yeah.
I mean, the RIAT organisers quite liked it themselves because they awarded us the prize for this display of the weekend with that. So it went across quite well amongst the public, but it also went down with other display pilots and the display organisers. They quite appreciated it as well.
Has anybody tried to copy it since, do you know?
Well, I mean, I had an interesting conversation with the display organisation committee at Farnborough a year or two earlier, because at Farnborough we had done something similar, but we climbed to about 300 feet before we turned at Farnborough, because there are very, very specific rules on what you can and can't do. And the day after I did the takeoff, the Boeing 787 test pilot did a similar sort of thing, except he turned at about 100 feet and was given a red card and sent back home to America. And the display directors said it was my fault. He'd seen me and copied me. So I think that's a little bit harsh. But yeah, big aircraft don't generally turn like that close to the ground. And you have to plan it and brief it and do it very, very carefully. And I think that at Farnborough, they decided that the Boeing guy had just done it there and then and not actually planned it in the same way that we had at RIAT.
Kev, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you. Thanks very much for spending time with us and answering the questions. You enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks a lot.
That's all for today's episode of Into the Sky. We hope you've enjoyed soaring through the legacy of XH558 with us. Your support helps keep the story of the Vulcan alive, and if you'd like to support the Trust a little more, or find out more about what is happening, why not visit our website, vulcantothesky.org. There you can learn more about our mission, and here you can also make a donation if you wish. You can follow us on social media for behind-the-scenes content and updates. And sharing this podcast with fellow aviation enthusiasts is another great way of supporting the Trust and helping keep this legacy alive. Every contribution to preserve this iconic aircraft for generations to come is greatly appreciated. Thank you again for listening. Until next time, keep your ears tuned into the sky.